What drives a person to take a human life? It is the fundamental question at the heart of every homicide investigation, the central mystery that profilers, psychologists, and detectives strive to unravel. In the grim landscape of true crime, we often encounter motives that are, while horrifying, grimly understandable. Greed, jealousy, rage, revenge, these are the dark, primal emotions that have fueled violence since the dawn of humanity. They are recognizable, extensions of feelings we have all experienced, twisted into a lethal form. But there exists another category of killer, a rarer and more disturbing breed. These are the individuals whose motivations defy simple explanation, whose reasons for killing are born from minds so fractured, so alien to our own, that they seem to belong to a different reality. Their logic is a labyrinth of delusion, their desires a tapestry of grotesque fantasy. They are not driven by a stolen wallet or a broken heart, but by voices in their heads, by a need to fulfill a bizarre prophecy, or by a philosophical framework so warped it redefines the very meaning of life and death. This is a journey into that abyss. We will not be looking at the killers who murdered for money or for love triangles gone wrong. Instead, we are examining 10 cases of a special kind of evil, where the why is infinitely more terrifying than the how. We will explore the lives of killers who believed they were saviors, vampires, gods, and artists, and whose crimes were merely the final, bloody brushstroke in a masterpiece of madness. These are the stories of the most twisted motives in modern criminal history. Our exploration begins not in the shadowy alleys of a sprawling metropolis, but under the seemingly tranquil, sun-drenched skies of 1970s California. It was a time of counterculture, of new ideas, and spiritual awakenings. But for one young man, this era of enlightenment would curdle into a period of profound darkness, a time when the voices in his head began to demand a terrible price to keep the world from falling apart. Herbert Mullen was born in Salinas, California in 1947. By all accounts, his early life was unremarkable, even idyllic. He was popular, voted most likely to succeed in high school, and had a close-knit group of friends. He was a bright, sensitive young man with a promising future, a quintessential product of post-war American optimism. But the first crack in this perfect facade appeared with a tragedy that would shatter his world and send him spiraling into a reality of his own making. In 1965, just after his high school graduation, Mullen's best friend, Dean Richardson, was killed in a horrific car accident. Mullen was devastated. He built a shrine to his friend in his bedroom and became obsessed with communicating with him, delving into Eastern religions and the concept of reincarnation. The grief was more than a young mind could bear. It was the catalyst, the pressure point that would break the dam holding back a torrent of latent mental illness. Over the next few years, Mullen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began experimenting heavily with LSD and marijuana, which likely exacerbated an underlying predisposition to schizophrenia. He would speak of elaborate conspiracies, of hearing voices, and of receiving messages from the universe. His family, alarmed and confused, tried to get him help, leading to several brief and unsuccessful stints in mental institutions. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but in an era of deinstitutionalization, he was repeatedly released, a ticking time bomb of psychosis set loose upon an unsuspecting public. By late 1972, Mullen's private world had fully crystallized into a terrifying new logic. The voices, which he now attributed to his father, were no longer just whispers. They were commands. They presented him with a chilling ultimatum. The Great San Andreas Fault was overdue for a catastrophic earthquake, one that would plunge all of California into the sea. The only way to prevent this apocalypse, the voices insisted, was through a series of human sacrifices. Blood had to be shed to appease the earth and maintain the delicate balance of nature. On October 13, 1972, Herbert Mullen acted on these commands for the first time. He saw a homeless man, Lawrence White, walking along a quiet road in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Believing White had telepathically agreed to be a sacrifice, Mullen pulled over, opened his car hood as a ruse, and then beat the 55-year-old man to death with a baseball bat. He dragged the body into the woods, convinced he had just saved countless lives. This was not murder in his mind. It was a necessary, even noble act. His delusion required constant reinforcement. The need for sacrifices became a relentless, driving force. His second victim was Mary Guilfoyle, a 24-year-old college student who was running late to an interview. Mullen offered her a ride, then stabbed her in the chest and stomach, dissecting her body and scattering the remains along a hillside. He later claimed she had also consented telepathically, a willing offering to the cause of preventing the Great Quake. With each killing, Mullen's methodology and rationalizations grew more elaborate. He began to see signs and portents everywhere. He believed that the Vietnam War was creating a deficit of American deaths, a karmic imbalance that he was personally responsible for correcting through his sacrifices. The deaths of soldiers overseas were, in his mind, preventing natural disasters at home. With the war winding down, he felt the burden fell squarely on his shoulders. His next victim was a priest, Father Henri Tomei, who he visited for confession at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Mullen believed the priest had volunteered to be a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the congregation. After a brief, rambling confession, he stabbed and beat the 64-year-old priest, leaving his body in the confessional. Mullen felt a sense of righteous purpose, believing he was not just appeasing the earth, but also doing God's work. As 1973 began, Mullen's killing spree escalated dramatically. His sense of urgency was palpable. He believed a major earthquake was imminent, and he was running out of time. In January, he bought a .22 pistol, and his selection of victims became less specific and more random. Anyone who crossed his path could be a potential sacrifice, chosen by the universe for a higher purpose. He murdered Jim Gennara, an old high school friend who had sold him marijuana, and Gennara's wife, Joan. He shot them both, believing Jim had telepathically revealed the date of the next earthquake. He then went to the home of Kathy Francis, another acquaintance, and shot her and her 2 young sons, ages 4 and 9. The motive was the same twisted logic. They were all sacrifices to nature, necessary deaths to prevent a greater catastrophe. His final act of violence occurred on February 13, 1973. He was driving through a residential neighborhood in Santa Cruz when he saw an elderly man, Fred Perez, working in his yard. For no reason other than opportunity, Mullen made a U-turn, got out of his car, and shot the 72-year-old man in the chest in broad daylight. This time, however, there was a witness. A neighbor saw the shooting and the car and was able to provide police with a description and a partial license plate number. A patrol officer spotted Mullen's car minutes later and pulled him over. The arrest was calm and uneventful. Inside the car, police found the murder weapon. The 4-month reign of terror, which had claimed 13 lives, was finally over. The man responsible was not a monster of cunning and malice, but a slave to a shattered mind. During his interrogation and subsequent trial, the full, bizarre scope of Mullen's motive was laid bare. He spoke calmly and rationally about the impending earthquakes, about the voices, about the telepathic consent of his victims, and about his role as a savior. He showed investigators where he had left the bodies, not with remorse, but with the pride of a man explaining his life's work. He genuinely believed his actions were heroic. The trial became a battle of legal and psychiatric definitions. The prosecution painted him as a methodical killer who knew right from wrong, pointing to his attempts to cover his tracks as evidence of his sanity. The defense argued that he was clearly not guilty by reason of insanity, a man living in a completely different reality governed by paranoid delusions. The jury, however, struggled to reconcile the horrific nature of the crimes with the concept of a man too sick to be responsible. Ultimately, they found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict implied a degree of premeditation and sanity that his psychological state seemed to contradict. He was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that left many questioning the legal system's ability to handle cases where the line between evil and illness is so profoundly blurred. Herbert Mullen's case is a chilling study in the catastrophic failure of the mental health system and the terrifying power of psychosis. His motive was not born of hatred or greed, but of a deeply ingrained delusional belief that he was a reluctant hero, a man forced to kill in order to save. In his own mind, the 13 people he murdered were not victims, but necessary sacrifices for the greater good of humanity. It is this internal logic, so coherent to him and so incomprehensible to us, that makes his motive one of the most twisted on record. While Mullen's delusions were rooted in a twisted sense of altruism, our next case takes us into a world of pure, parasitic horror. We journey back to Sacramento, California, just a few years after Mullen's capture, to a city that would be stalked by a predator whose motives were not a product of misdirected heroism, but of a primal, terrifying need. He was a man who believed he was dying, and that the only way to survive was to consume the lives of others in the most literal way imaginable. Richard Trenton Chase was born in Santa Clara County, California, in 1950. His childhood was a textbook example of a troubled upbringing, marked by a strict, authoritarian father and a home environment rife with conflict. From a young age, Chase exhibited signs of deep psychological disturbance, including the MacDonald triad of bedwetting, cruelty to animals, and pyromania, behaviors often seen as precursors to violent offending in adulthood. As a teenager, his problems intensified. He descended into a world of heavy drug use, primarily with LSD, which seemed to unlock or accelerate a severe underlying psychosis. He became a hypochondriac, obsessed with the belief that his body was failing him. He complained that his heart would randomly stop beating, that his pulmonary artery had been stolen, and that his stomach was upside down. His delusions were somatic, focused entirely on the decay of his own physical form. His parents, unable to cope with his increasingly bizarre and frightening behavior, had him committed to a mental institution. There, his psychosis blossomed in horrifying ways. He would catch and kill small birds, devouring them raw, sometimes injecting their blood into his veins with a syringe. This behavior earned him the chilling nickname, Dracula, from the hospital staff. Despite these profoundly disturbing actions, he was deemed no longer a danger to society after a period of treatment and was released into the care of his mother. Once free, Chase was left to his own devices in a small apartment, his mental state continuing to deteriorate without supervision. His central delusion began to solidify. He believed his blood was turning to powder and evaporating. To combat this, he needed to replenish his supply from an external source. He began capturing, killing, and disemboweling small animals, rabbits, cats, and dogs, and consuming their blood and organs in a desperate, ritualistic attempt to save his own life. But the blood of animals was not enough. His delusion demanded a more potent source. In the final days of 1977, his private rituals of bloodletting spilled over into the human world. On December 29th, he committed his first murder. He fired a .22 caliber rifle into the home of Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and father, killing him in a drive-by shooting. The act was impersonal, a test of his resolve, but it lacked the one thing his delusion craved: access to blood. Chase's methodology then shifted. He began to test the doors of houses in his neighborhood, a peculiar habit that would later become his signature. He believed that an unlocked door was an invitation to enter, while a locked door was a sign that he was not welcome. This bizarre superstition dictated who would live and who would die. For weeks, he roamed his suburban neighborhood, a specter of death checking locks, until he found a door that opened for him. On January 23, 1978, he found that open door. He entered the home of Teresa Wallin, a 22-year-old who was 3 months pregnant. What he did to her was an act of unimaginable horror, a direct manifestation of his vampiric delusion. He shot her 3 times, then mutilated her body, engaging in necrophilia and cannibalism. He drank her blood, using a yogurt container he found in her kitchen. He had finally found the cure his madness demanded. The city of Sacramento was thrown into a state of panic. The crime scene was so gruesome, so utterly bizarre, that investigators were baffled. They were dealing with a killer unlike any they had ever encountered. The FBI was called in, and profiler Robert Ressler developed a now famous profile of the suspect, a white male in his mid-20s, severely mentally ill, living alone, disheveled, and likely with a history of animal cruelty and psychiatric institutionalization. The profile was astonishingly accurate. Just 4 days later, before the city could even process the horror of the Wallin murder, Chase struck again. He entered another unlocked home, this one belonging to 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth. Inside, he found a scene of domestic life that he would systematically destroy. He shot and killed Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, and her 51-year-old friend Dan Meredith. The horror did not end there. He abducted Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew, David, who she was babysitting. The scene that greeted investigators was one of almost indescribable carnage. Chase had once again engaged in mutilation and cannibalism. He had taken the infant, David, with him. A massive manhunt was launched for the missing child and the killer, who was now known as the Vampire of Sacramento. The city was paralyzed by fear, with residents locking their doors and buying guns at an unprecedented rate. Chase returned to his apartment with the infant's body, where he continued his grotesque rituals. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A former classmate of Chase's recognized him from a news report and recalled his strange behavior. She told police that Chase had recently tried to get her to go into the woods with him and that he had talked about the need to drink blood. She gave them his address. When police arrived at Chase's apartment, he was gone, but the door was unlocked. What they found inside was a charnel house, a physical manifestation of his psychosis. The apartment was filthy, littered with animal collars and refuse. The blender contained liquefied animal remains. And in the refrigerator, they found human body parts. The evidence was overwhelming. They had found their killer's lair. Chase was apprehended shortly after, his car filled with blood-stained evidence, including the .22 rifle used in the murders. He was arrested without a fight. During his interrogation, he was calm and forthcoming, explaining his actions with the detached logic of his delusion. He told investigators that he had to drink blood to survive because of a soap dish poisoning plot orchestrated by Nazis who were trying to turn his blood into powder. His trial was a media circus. The defense argued that he was clearly insane, a man so disconnected from reality that he could not be held responsible for his actions. They presented evidence of his long history of severe mental illness and his bizarre somatic delusions. The prosecution, however, argued that his actions, such as cleaning his weapons and attempting to dispose of evidence, showed that he understood the wrongful nature of his crimes. They sought the death penalty. The jury was faced with the same dilemma as in the Mullen case: how to apply legal standards of sanity to a mind so obviously broken. They ultimately sided with the prosecution, finding Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. As the verdict was read, Chase reportedly cried out in fear, not of the sentence, but of the prospect of being forced to eat the prison food, which he believed was poisoned. He was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. In December 1980, before his sentence could be carried out, Richard Trenton Chase was found dead in his cell. He had saved up his prescribed antidepressant medication for weeks and taken a fatal overdose. Even in his final act, he was a slave to his hypochondria, telling other inmates he was committing suicide because he feared the prison doctors were part of the conspiracy to poison him. Richard Trenton Chase remains one of the most disturbing figures in the annals of true crime. His motive was not a complex philosophy or a misguided quest for justice. It was a primal, parasitic need born from a complete psychotic break with reality. He was a man who saw other human beings not as people, but as resources, as walking blood bags necessary for his own survival. His case is a terrifying illustration of what happens when the human mind untethers itself from reality and regresses into a state of pure predatory instinct. From the vampiric delusions of a man trying to save himself, we now turn to a case where the motive was allegedly a divine command. We move to the suburbs of Philadelphia, to the story of a seemingly ordinary family man, a shoemaker, who claimed he was on a mission from God. But this mission was not one of peace and salvation. It was a campaign of terror, torture, and murder, orchestrated by a voice he called Charlie. Joseph Callinger's life began in hardship. Born in 1935, he was placed in an orphanage after his mother was unable to care for him. At the age of 2, he was adopted by Stephen and Anna Callinger, a couple who would subject him to a childhood of horrific abuse. He was beaten, starved, and subjected to bizarre and cruel punishments. His adoptive father, a staunchly religious and deeply disturbed man, performed surgeries on Joseph to cure his perceived misbehaviors, such as tying his penis to a string attached to a window to stop his bedwetting. This relentless torment fractured the young boy's psyche, planting the seeds of a profound and violent mental illness. He developed severe headaches and began to experience visual and auditory hallucinations. He saw a disembodied head floating in his room, a specter he would later name Charlie. This hallucination would become his guide, his confidant, and ultimately his demonic co-conspirator. As an adult, Callinger tried to build a life of normalcy. He married, had children, and opened a shoe repair shop in Philadelphia. To the outside world, he was a working-class family man. But beneath this veneer, his mind was a storm of paranoia, religious fervor, and violent fantasies. The abuse he had suffered as a child had instilled in him a deep-seated rage and a distorted view of God and justice. In the early 1970s, Callinger's mental state began to rapidly decline. He suffered a series of personal and professional setbacks, including a fire that destroyed his shoe shop, which he was suspected of setting himself for the insurance money. He became convinced that the world was against him, a corrupt and sinful place that needed to be cleansed. It was during this period that Charlie began to speak to him more frequently, his whispers evolving into clear, undeniable commands. Charlie told Callinger that he was a chosen one, an angel selected by God to save the world from damnation. But his mission was not to preach or heal. His mission was to eliminate all of humanity, sparing only his own family, so that he could ascend to heaven and become God himself. To achieve this, he needed to accumulate power and knowledge, which he believed he could gain by torturing and tormenting others. In 1974, Callinger's divine mission turned deadly. He became convinced that his own 13-year-old son, Joseph Jr., was a rival, a potential challenger to his divine authority. In a fit of paranoid rage, he murdered the boy. He staged the death to look like an accident, and the authorities initially believed his story. He had committed the ultimate act of betrayal, but in his mind, it was a necessary step in his ascension to godhood. The death of his son seemed to open a floodgate of violence. With his 12-year-old son Michael now enlisted as his unwilling accomplice, Kallinger embarked on a reign of terror across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. He and Michael would break into homes, taking families hostage. Kallinger, guided by the voice of Charlie, would subject the families to hours of psychological and physical torture, elaborate rituals of humiliation and pain that he believed were tests of their worthiness. His method was terrifyingly consistent. He would force his victims to act out his bizarre fantasies, all while he delivered rambling sermons about God, sin, and his own divine purpose. He was not primarily interested in theft. The robberies were an afterthought. His true goal was the complete domination and psychological destruction of his victims. He was seeking to understand the mechanics of human suffering, a knowledge he believed he needed to become God. On January 8, 1975, Kallinger and Michael broke into a home in Leonia, New Jersey. The home invasion followed the usual pattern of torture and torment, but this time it escalated to murder. Kallinger killed a 21-year-old nurse named Maria Foshing, one of the captives in the house. The act was senseless and brutal, a final, bloody exclamation point on a night of horror. He had crossed a line, and the investigation into the series of home invasions now became a murder hunt. During the Leonia home invasion, one of the victims managed to escape and call the police. When the authorities arrived, Kallinger and Michael had already fled, but they had left behind a crucial piece of evidence, a bag containing a hood and other items. The police were able to get a description of the attackers, and a massive investigation was launched. The press dubbed the unknown assailant the Shoemaker, a name that would prove eerily prophetic. Kallinger was eventually apprehended after being identified by one of his surviving victims. His son, Michael, terrified and traumatized, confessed to his role in the crimes, providing investigators with a chilling inside look at his father's madness. He described the voice of Charlie, the divine mission, and the years of abuse that had led them down this dark path. Joseph Kallinger's trial was a spectacle of psychiatric testimony. The defense argued that he was a classic case of paranoid schizophrenia, a man so controlled by his delusions that he was not legally responsible for his actions. They detailed the horrific abuse of his childhood and the long history of his hallucinations. They painted a portrait of a man living in a world where God and a disembodied head named Charlie commanded him to kill. The prosecution countered that Kallinger was a cunning and sadistic manipulator who used a feigned mental illness to justify his lust for power and violence. They pointed to the organized nature of his crimes and his attempts to evade capture as proof of his sanity. They argued that Charlie was nothing more than a convenient excuse, a manifestation of his own evil desires. The jury convicted him of murder and a host of other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. In a strange twist, his son Michael, who had acted as his accomplice under duress, was sent to a youth facility and was eventually able to build a new life for himself, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable trauma. Joseph Kallinger died in prison in 1996. He spent his years behind bars in the psychiatric wing, still claiming to be on a mission from God, still tormented by the voices that had led him to destroy so many lives, including those of his own family. His motive was a terrifying fusion of religious delusion, paranoid schizophrenia, and the deep, unhealed wounds of childhood abuse. He was a man who sought to become God by acting like the devil, a shoemaker who tried to mend the world by tearing it apart. Our next case takes us deep into the remote wilderness of Northern California, to a story that reads like a survivalist horror film. It is a tale of two men who created their own twisted society, complete with a self-penned constitution and a chillingly specific plan for surviving a nuclear apocalypse. Their motive was not a message from God or a vampiric thirst, but a carefully constructed paranoid fantasy of societal collapse and ultimate control. Leonard Lake was a man obsessed with control and survival. Born in 1945, he had a troubled and nomadic childhood. He developed a fascination with pornography, weapons, and survivalist literature. He served 2 tours in Vietnam as a radar operator in the Marine Corps, an experience that likely deepened his paranoia and distrust of authority. After his discharge, he drifted, his mind consumed with elaborate fantasies of power and domination. He eventually settled in a remote, wooded area in Wilseyville, California, where he began to build a bunker. This was not just a simple fallout shelter, it was the intended capital of his new world order. He believed that a nuclear holocaust was inevitable, and he was preparing to be one of the few survivors. But his plan for repopulating the Earth was a deeply disturbing one, a fantasy born from his darkest desires. In the early 1980s, Lake found the perfect partner for his paranoid vision, Charles Neng. Neng was a Hong Kong native who had a history of discipline problems and petty crime. He moved to the United States on a student visa, but quickly dropped out and enlisted in the Marines, using falsified documents. He was a man with a sadistic streak, a perfect and willing accomplice for the world Lake was trying to build. Together, they conceived what they called Operation Miranda. The name was a dark, ironic twist on the Miranda rights read to suspects upon arrest. In their version, Miranda was a woman's name, the name of the ideal female slave they intended to capture and keep in their bunker after the apocalypse. Their plan was to abduct and imprison women to serve as their sexual slaves and to help repopulate their new world. Men and children were deemed expendable, to be killed for their resources or simply for sport. From their remote compound in Wilseyville, Lake and Neng began to carry out their horrific plan. They would lure people to their property with promises of work or by answering ads for used equipment. Once their victims arrived, they were ambushed, captured, and subjected to unimaginable torture. Lake, a prolific and meticulous diarist, documented their crimes in a series of videotapes and journals. These tapes are perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case. They show Lake and Nung tormenting their female captives, forcing them to perform humiliating acts under the threat of death. In one infamous tape, they systematically terrorize a young woman named Brenda O'Connor, who they had lured to the property along with her boyfriend and infant son. The tapes are a cold, detached record of pure sadism, a home movie of hell. Their victims were diverse. They included Lonnie Bond, his girlfriend Brenda O'Connor, and their infant son, Lonnie Jr. They murdered their neighbor, Harvey Dubbs, his wife Anne, and their son, Sean. They killed men for their cars, their money, and their identification, which Ang would use to avoid detection by immigration authorities. The total number of victims is unknown, but it is estimated to be as high as 25. Lake's bunker was the centerpiece of their operation. It was a concrete reinforced structure hidden on the property, complete with a hidden chamber behind a false wall. This chamber was their torture room in prison, soundproofed and equipped with restraints. It was here that they would carry out the darkest parts of Operation Miranda, living out their fantasy of total control over their captives. For several years, they operated with impunity, their remote location and cunning providing a shield from the outside world. The disappearances of their victims were often not connected, making it difficult for law enforcement to establish a pattern. They were ghosts, preying on the transient and the unsuspecting, leaving a trail of missing persons reports that stretched across Northern California. Their downfall came not from a massive investigation, but from a simple act of shoplifting. In June 1985, Charles Neng was caught stealing a vise from a hardware store in South San Francisco. Lake, who was with him, was also detained. In the trunk of their car, police found a .22 caliber pistol equipped with an illegal silencer. This was the beginning of the end. At the police station, Lake, using a fake name, asked for a glass of water and a pen and paper. He wrote a short note to his ex-wife, then swallowed a cyanide capsule he had sewn into his clothing. He collapsed and died in custody 4 days later, taking many of his secrets with him. He had enacted his final survival plan, choosing suicide over capture and the loss of control. Charles Ning, however, managed to escape. He fled the hardware store during the initial confusion and became one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. The investigation then turned to the identity of the man who had committed suicide. When police identified him as Leonard Lake and searched his Wilseyville property, they began to uncover the true scale of the horror. They found the bunker, the hidden torture chamber, and the videotapes. They found Lake's detailed journals, which chronicled his twisted philosophy and his crimes. And they began to find human remains. Using heavy equipment, investigators unearthed thousands of charred bone fragments from burn pits scattered across the property. They had stumbled upon a private graveyard, a testament to years of torture and murder. The search for Charles Ning became an international manhunt. He was eventually captured in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, after a shootout with security guards during another shoplifting attempt. A long and arduous extradition battle ensued, but he was finally returned to California to stand trial for his role in the murders. Eng's trial was one of the longest and most expensive in California history. He acted as his own lawyer for a time, using the courtroom as a stage for his manipulative and disruptive behavior. He claimed he was merely a pawn, a reluctant participant in Lake's schemes. The prosecution, however, used the videotapes and other evidence to portray him as an enthusiastic and sadistic partner in the crimes. In 1999, after years of legal wrangling, Charles N. was found guilty of 11 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death and remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison to this day. The full extent of their crimes may never be known, as the fragmented and burned remains made identification of all the victims impossible. Leonard Lake and Charles Ning were driven by a motive that was both grandiose and pathetic. They were fueled by a paranoid survivalist fantasy, a belief that they were the architects of a new world. Operation Miranda was the constitution of their two-man society, a society built on a foundation of torture, rape, and murder. Their motive was the ultimate expression of narcissistic control, a desire to play God in a world they were convinced was about to end, creating their own private apocalypse in the woods of Northern California. From a fantasy of post-apocalyptic survival, we journey to a case that blurs the line between crime and a consensual, albeit horrifying, act. We travel to the quiet, picturesque town of Rothenburg, Germany, at the dawn of the 21st century. Here, in a quaint, half-timbered house, a man would fulfill a lifelong fantasy, a desire so taboo and so bizarre that it challenges our most fundamental understanding of victimhood and intent. Armin Meiwes was, by all outward appearances, a completely ordinary man. He was a computer technician for the German military, a respected and competent professional. He lived a quiet life in the large, secluded house he had inherited from his parents. He was polite, unassuming, and had no criminal record. But behind this mask of normalcy, Meiwes harbored a fantasy that had consumed him since childhood, a deep, obsessive desire to eat another human being. This fantasy was not born of rage or a desire to dominate. It was, in his mind, an act of ultimate connection, a way to literally incorporate another person into himself, to make them a permanent part of him. It was a lonely child's fantasy, twisted into a grotesque adult obsession. He spent years exploring this desire in the dark corners of the internet, in forums and chat rooms dedicated to cannibalism fantasies. For a long time, it remained just that, a fantasy. But in 2001, Meiwes decided to take the next step. He posted an advertisement on a website called The Cannibal Cafe. The ad was chillingly direct, looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. He was not looking for a victim to hunt or overpower. He was looking for a willing participant, someone who shared his fantasy from the other side, someone who wanted to be eaten. Incredibly, he received several responses. After a few false starts with candidates who were not serious, he found the man he was looking for, Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin. Brandes, like Maiwes, lived a seemingly normal life, but he harbored his own dark fantasy, a desire to be killed and consumed. For him, it was the ultimate act of submission and self-destruction. After exchanging emails and establishing that they were both serious, Brandes traveled by train to Rothenburg to meet Maiwes. On March 9, 2001, the two men met at the train station and went back to Maiwes' home. What followed was a surreal and horrifying sequence of events, all of which Maiwes meticulously documented on videotape. At the house, Brandes willingly consumed sleeping pills and a large amount of alcohol. Then, in a pre-agreed-upon act, Maiwes severed Brandes' penis. Their initial plan was to cook and eat it together, but Maiwes burned it in the pan, making it inedible. The act itself caused Brandes to begin bleeding profusely. Maiwes helped him to a bathtub, where Brandes slowly bled to death over the course of several hours. During this time, Maiwes read a Star Trek book aloud to him. After Brandes had died from blood loss, Maiwes took his body to a specially prepared slaughtering room in his house. He dismembered the body, carefully packaging and freezing the meat for later consumption. Over the next 10 months, Armin Maiwes would periodically eat parts of burned Brandes, an act he considered a form of communion, a way of keeping Brandes with him forever. Maiwes' secret life might have remained hidden indefinitely had he not gone back online to find another volunteer. In late 2002, a college student in Austria came across Maiwes' new advertisements and posts, which included details of the slaughter. The student alerted the German police, who were initially skeptical. The story seemed too bizarre to be true. But they investigated, and a search of Maiwes' home quickly confirmed the student's story. Police found the frozen human remains, the slaughtering room, and, most damningly, the 4-hour videotape that documented the entire event. Maiwes was arrested and confessed immediately, providing a calm and detailed account of what had happened. He was not remorseful in the traditional sense. He saw the act as a consensual one between two people fulfilling a shared fantasy. His arrest and subsequent trial created a media frenzy in Germany and around the world. The case presented a unique legal and ethical conundrum. How do you prosecute a murder when the victim was a willing, even enthusiastic participant? German law at the time had no specific statute against cannibalism. The prosecution was forced to navigate a complex legal landscape. Initially, Maiwes was charged with manslaughter. His defense argued that it was not murder, but a case of killing on request, a form of illegal euthanasia which carried a much lighter sentence. They presented Brandes as a deeply suicidal man who had found a unique way to end his life. The videotape, while horrifying, seemed to support the idea of consent. The court was faced with a difficult decision. In 2004, Maiwes was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. The verdict was met with public outcry. Many felt that the sentence was far too lenient for such a gruesome act, regardless of the issue of consent. The prosecution appealed the verdict, arguing that Maiwes had killed for his own gratification, which should qualify as murder. In a retrial in 2006, the court took a different view. They focused on the psychological aspects of the crime, arguing that Brandes, while a willing participant, was not in a sound state of mind to give true legal consent. The court ruled that Maiwes had manipulated a mentally disturbed man to fulfill his own sexual and cannibalistic fantasies. This time, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Armin Meiwes's motive is perhaps one of the most unique and disturbing in criminal history because it hinges on the concept of consent. He was not a predator in the traditional sense. He was a man seeking a partner for a shared taboo fantasy. His crime was not one of violence against an unwilling victim, but the final, horrifying act in a bizarre contract between two deeply disturbed individuals. It forces us to question the very definition of murder and the limits of personal autonomy, exploring a dark corner of human desire where the lines between killer and victim become terrifyingly blurred. From a consensual act of cannibalism, we now travel to Japan, to a case that delves into the world of otaku culture and the disturbing intersection of fantasy and reality. The late 1980s saw Japan at the height of its economic boom, a period of prosperity and social order. But beneath this calm surface, a series of horrific crimes against young children would terrorize the Saitama and Tokyo prefectures, perpetrated by a man whose motives were a deeply disturbing blend of psychological disorders and a desire to preserve his victims as objects. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born in 1962 in a small town west of Tokyo. He was born with a congenital hand deformity, his wrists fused in a way that made it difficult for him to move them. This disability made him a target for bullying throughout his childhood and led to him becoming a social outcast. He retreated from the world, finding solace in the fantasy realms of anime and manga, the comics and animated films that are a cornerstone of Japanese popular culture. He became what is known in Japan as an otaku, a term for someone with obsessive interests, particularly in anime and manga. His room was filled with thousands of videotapes, a library of fantasy that became his only reality. But his interests veered into the darkest subgenres, horror and violent content involving inappropriate themes. His fantasy life began to merge with deeply disturbing obsessions. As a young adult, Miyazaki was isolated and socially inept. He worked a low-level job at his family's printing press, spending his free time and money on his ever-growing collection of videos and comics. He struggled to form relationships, particularly with women, and his sense of alienation deepened. The world of fantasy was more real and more welcoming to him than the world of people. In 1988, this dark internal world erupted into reality. Between August 1988 and June 1989, Miyazaki committed crimes against 4 young children, ages 4 to 7. His methods were horrifying. He would lure the children into his car and harm them in remote, wooded areas, then engage in deeply disturbing post-mortem behaviors. But his motive was not simply sexual gratification. Miyazaki was obsessed with the idea of preservation. He wanted to stop time, to keep his victims as they were, like characters in his videos. He would photograph and videotape their bodies, documenting his acts. He dismembered them, keeping parts of their bodies, hands, feet, heads, as trophies. He even went so far as to drink the blood of one of his victims and eat parts of her hands, later claiming he did it to feel closer to her. After the murders, Miyazaki engaged in a bizarre and cruel game of cat and mouse with the victims' families and the media. He sent a series of taunting, posthumous postcards to the families, written as if from the victims themselves. He sent a package to one family containing the cremated remains of their daughter, along with some of her teeth and photos of her clothing. The cruelty was immense, a way for him to prolong his fantasy and exert control even after the act was done. He also sent letters to the media, adopting the persona of a female vampire character from a horror anime. These letters were rambling and cryptic, filled with references to his otaku interests. He seemed to be trying to create a narrative, to turn his real-life horror story into a piece of fiction, with himself as the mysterious, monstrous protagonist. This act of self-mythologizing was a key part of his motive. He was not just a killer, but the creator of his own dark tale. The police were baffled. The crimes were so heinous and the killer's behavior so erratic that they struggled to build a profile. The case created a moral panic in Japan, with the media and public alike blaming the otaku subculture for creating a monster. The case led to a widespread stigma against anime and manga fans, a controversy that continues to be debated in Japan to this day. On July 23, 1989, Miyazaki was caught in the act of attempting to approach another young child. The child's father chased him down, and he was arrested for attempted assault. It was only when police searched his car and his home that they discovered the full extent of his crimes. They found his massive video collection, disturbing photographs and videos, and evidence he had kept from his crimes. The otaku murderer, as the press had dubbed him, was finally in custody. His trial was a long and complex affair, centered on the question of his mental state. His defense team argued that he was suffering from a multiple personality disorder, claiming that it was an alternate personality, Rat Man, who had committed the crimes. They pointed to his bizarre behavior and his inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality as evidence of his insanity. Psychiatric evaluations were contradictory. Some experts diagnosed him with schizophrenia, while others believed he was sane and fully aware of his actions. The prosecution argued that his crimes, while bizarre, were planned and executed with a clear mind. They portrayed him as a sexually motivated sadist who used his otaku interests as a blueprint for his crimes. Ultimately, the court rejected the insanity defense. In 1997, Tsutomu Miyazaki was found guilty of the 4 murders and sentenced to death. He showed little emotion as the verdict was read. After a series of appeals, he was executed by hanging in 2008. He never expressed remorse for his crimes, remaining trapped in his own fantasy world until the very end. Miyazaki's motive was a chilling cocktail of sexual deviancy, social isolation, and a profound confusion between fantasy and reality. He was a man who sought to possess and preserve the innocence he could not have, to turn real children into the inanimate objects of his collection. His crimes were an attempt to physically manifest his darkest fantasies, to pull the characters from his videos into the real world with devastating and tragic consequences. He was a collector whose ultimate prize was the lives of the innocent. We now travel back in time and across the globe to post-war England, a place of austerity and rebuilding. It is here that we encounter a man of charm and sophistication, a man who moved in respectable circles. But behind his dapper exterior was a cold, calculating mind that had devised a unique and gruesome method of murder, driven by a twisted interpretation of the law and an insatiable greed. John George High, who would become known to the world as the acid bath murderer, was born in 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire. He was raised in a starkly religious household by parents who were members of the Plymouth Brethren, a conservative Protestant sect. His upbringing was strict and isolating, instilling in him a sense of detachment from the world and a belief that he was different, set apart from others. He was a bright student and a talented musician, but he was also drawn to a life of deception. As a young man, he embarked on a career of fraud and forgery, which landed him in prison on several occasions. It was in prison that he began to experiment with sulfuric acid, observing its effects on mice. He was not just a common criminal, he was a budding scientist of death, a man looking for a foolproof way to make his problems and people disappear. High developed a chilling and deeply flawed legal theory. He came to believe in the principle of corpus delicti, a Latin term meaning the body of the crime. He misinterpreted this to mean that if a victim's body could not be found, then a murder conviction was impossible. This belief became the cornerstone of his homicidal method. He would not just kill his victims, he would dissolve them, erasing their very existence from the physical world. In the mid-1940s, High put his theory into practice. He was a man of expensive tastes, and his fraudulent schemes were no longer providing the income he desired. He decided to turn to murder for profit. His first victim was his former employer, William McSwan. In September 1944, he lured McSwan to his workshop in London, bludgeoned him to death, and then placed his body in a 40-gallon drum filled with concentrated sulfuric acid. 2 days later, all that remained was a thick sludge, which he poured down a drain. With William out of the way, High turned his attention to William's wealthy parents, Donald and Amy McSwan. He told them their son had gone into hiding to avoid military service. For months, he maintained the charade, all while systematically selling off their son's properties and living off the proceeds. When the McSwans became suspicious, High lured them to the same workshop in July 1945 and subjected them to the same gruesome fate, dissolving their bodies in acid and forging documents to steal their entire estate. For several years, High lived a life of luxury on the McSwans' fortune. He was a dandy, a man about town, known for his expensive suits and charming demeanor. But his spending was reckless, and by 1947, he was once again in need of money. He found his next victims in Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife, Rose. He met them while pretending to be interested in buying their house. He gained their trust, and in February 1948, he lured Dr. Henderson to a new workshop he had rented in Crawley. He shot him in the head and placed him in his acid bath. He then went to the Hendersons' hotel, told Rose that her husband had fallen ill, and drove her to the workshop, where he murdered her as well. He dissolved both of their bodies, sold off all of their possessions, and moved into their hotel room, continuing the pretense that they were simply away on holiday. High's final victim was Olive Durand Deacon, a wealthy 69-year-old widow who lived in the same hotel as him in Kensington. In February 1949, he invited her to his workshop under the guise of discussing a business idea for artificial fingernails. There, he shot her in the back of the head, stripped her of her valuables, and placed her in the now familiar drum of acid. This time, however, High made a mistake. Mrs. Durand Deacon was a well-known resident of the hotel, and her disappearance was noticed almost immediately. Her friends were suspicious of High, who seemed unconcerned, and was seen cleaning out the victim's room. They went to the police, who began to investigate John George High. A search of his workshop in Crawley revealed the horrifying truth. While the bodies were gone, investigators found damning evidence. They found his revolver, documents belonging to his victims, and, most importantly, they found gallstones and a partial set of dentures that had survived the acid. A pathologist was able to identify the dentures as belonging to Olive Durand Deacon. When confronted with this evidence, High's arrogance took over. Believing he could not be convicted without a body, he confessed to the murders of the McSwans, the Hendersons, and Mrs. Durand Deacon. He even confessed to 3 other unconfirmed murders. He was confident, telling the police, "How can you prove murder if there is no body?" He had staked his life on his flawed legal theory. He soon learned that his understanding of corpus delicti was wrong. The law does not require a physical body if there is sufficient evidence to prove a crime was committed. Faced with this reality, High's defense strategy shifted. He claimed insanity, concocting a story that he was a vampire who had killed for blood. He claimed to have drunk a glass of his victims' blood before dissolving their bodies. This was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to avoid the gallows. He told doctors of recurring dreams of blood that had plagued him since childhood. The prosecution, however, saw this as a transparent lie, a story fabricated by a cornered conman. They pointed to the financial motive behind all the killings and his methodical, calculated approach as clear evidence of his sanity. The jury agreed. After a short trial, they took only minutes to find him guilty of murder. John George High, the man who believed he had discovered the perfect crime, was sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging in August 1949. His case captivated post-war Britain, a story of a modern-day ghoul hiding in plain sight. High's motive was a unique and chilling blend of cold, calculating greed and a profound narcissistic belief in his own intellectual superiority. He was not driven by psychosis or a sexual compulsion. He was driven by a simple desire for a comfortable life and a belief that he was clever enough to get away with murder by literally erasing his victims from existence. His acid bath method was not just a means of disposal, it was the physical manifestation of his core belief that he could outsmart the law itself. From a man who believed he could erase a crime by erasing the body, we turn to a killer whose motive was deeply personal, rooted in a towering intellect and a lifetime of maternal resentment. We return to California in the early 1970s, to the story of a man so large in stature and intellect that he towered over everyone he met. But this giant was haunted by a rage so profound that it would leave him to commit some of the most shocking crimes of his generation. Edmund Kemper, known as the co-ed killer, was a paradox. With an IQ of 145, he was a certified genius. He was well-spoken, articulate, and capable of deep introspection. Yet, he was also a brutal serial killer, a necrophile, and a cannibal. The key to understanding this paradox lies in his tumultuous and deeply damaging relationship with his mother, Clarnell Strandberg. Born in 1948, Kemper was a large child, and his size, combined with his high intelligence, set him apart. His parents' marriage was a battlefield, and his mother, a domineering and emotionally abusive alcoholic, directed much of her bitterness and frustration at him. She belittled him, humiliated him, and locked him in the basement at night, telling him he was a freak and that no woman would ever want him. This constant barrage of psychological abuse warped Kemper's developing psyche. He grew to both hate and crave the approval of his mother. He fantasized about killing her, but also about a world where he could finally please her. This intense, unresolved conflict would become the central, driving force behind all of his future violence. At the age of 15, after being sent to live with his grandparents on their remote farm, this internal pressure exploded. Following an argument with his grandmother, he shot and killed her. When his grandfather returned home, Kemper shot him as well. He later explained his reasoning with a chilling detachment. He didn't want his grandfather to find out what he had done to his wife. He had killed his grandmother out of rage, and his grandfather out of a strange, twisted sense of compassion. Because of his age, Kemper was not sent to prison, but to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. There, he thrived. His high intelligence allowed him to manipulate the staff and psychiatrists. He learned the language of therapy, memorized the answers to psychological tests, and presented himself as a model patient. He convinced everyone that he was cured, that his violent outburst was a one-time event born of adolescent turmoil. In 1969, at the age of 21, Edmund Kemper was released against the recommendation of some of his psychiatrists. He was a free man, but the rage that had been simmering for years was about to boil over. He tried to join the police force, but was rejected due to his size. Instead, he drifted, living for a time with his mother, a situation that rekindled all of the old resentments and humiliations. Between May 1972 and February 1973, Kemper began a killing spree that targeted young female hitchhikers, mostly college students, in the Santa Cruz area. His size and non-threatening demeanor made him seem safe. He would pick up the young women, drive them to a secluded area, and then kill them. The murders were brutal, but for Kemper, they were secondary. The true focus of his fantasy was what came after death. He would take the bodies back to his mother's apartment, where he would dismember and violate them. These acts of necrophilia were a complex and twisted psychological ritual. By possessing the bodies of these young women, who he saw as symbols of the social acceptance he was denied, he was enacting a fantasy of power and control. They were stand-ins, surrogates for the one woman he truly wanted to dominate and destroy, his mother. He later explained that he felt these women, who were the same age and type as the girls who had rejected him in school, represented the social elite. By tilling them, he was taking what he felt he was owed. He would often have long, imaginary conversations with the severed heads of his victims, a detail that highlights the profound loneliness and social alienation at the heart of his pathology. For nearly a year, he terrorized the Santa Cruz area. The police had no leads. Kemper, with his high intelligence, was a careful and methodical killer. He even socialized with police officers at a local bar, gleaning information about the investigation into the very murders he was committing. He was hiding in plain sight, a monster disguised as a gentle giant. On April 20, 1973, Kemper decided it was time for his final act, the one his entire life of rage had been building towards. After an argument with his mother, he waited for her to fall asleep, then entered her bedroom and bludgeoned her to death with a hammer. He then decapitated her and committed a series of grotesque, symbolic acts of desecration against her body. It was the ultimate, horrifying expression of his lifelong hatred. After killing his mother, he invited her best friend, Sarah Hallett, over to the house and killed her as well. He later said he did it so she wouldn't have to find out what had happened to her friend. With his primary target eliminated, Kemper felt his life's purpose was complete. The rage that had fueled him for so long was gone, replaced by a strange emptiness. He fled the scene and began driving east. After a day or two on the road, he pulled over at a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, and called the police. He confessed to everything, the murder of his mother and her friend, and the 6 co-eds he had killed over the past year. The police in Santa Cruz were initially skeptical, but when they checked his mother's house, they found a scene of horror that confirmed his story. Kemper's confession was unlike any other. He was calm, articulate, and provided a stunningly insightful analysis of his own psychology. He explained the connection between the abuse he suffered from his mother and his murders of the co-eds. He saw his trial as a platform, a chance to finally be understood. He insisted on being found sane, wanting to take full credit for his actions, and even requested the death penalty, though it was not available in California at the time. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, where he remains today. He has given numerous interviews over the years, providing an invaluable, if terrifying, window into the mind of a serial killer. He speaks of his crimes with a chilling lack of emotion, analyzing his own motives with the precision of a psychiatrist. Edmund Kemper's motive was the culmination of a lifetime of psychological torture at the hands of his mother. His murder of the co-eds was a dress rehearsal, a way to practice and build up to the main event. Each young woman was a surrogate for his mother, a canvas on which he could paint his rage. His final, horrific act of matricide was not an impulsive crime, but the closing chapter of a long, dark story of resentment, humiliation, and a twisted, desperate need for control. Our next case takes us behind the Iron Curtain to the Soviet Union during its final, decaying years. It is the story of a man whose crimes were so numerous and so savage that they exposed the deep failings of a totalitarian state. His motive was not intellectual or philosophical, but rooted in a profound and lifelong sense of sexual inadequacy and failure, a frustration that he could only resolve through the ultimate act of violence. Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, was one of the most prolific serial killers of the 20th century. Born in Ukraine in 1936, his childhood was set against a backdrop of famine, war, and Stalinist terror. He was a weak and sickly child, subjected to bullying and chronic bedwetting. He was also haunted by a family story. His older brother had allegedly been abducted and cannibalized during the Great Famine of the 1930s. This story, whether true or not, instilled in him a deep-seated fear and a morbid fascination with death and dismemberment. As a young man, Chikatilo struggled with profound social and sexual anxieties. He was impotent, a condition that caused him immense shame and frustration in a society that prized masculine virility. He managed to marry and have children, but his sexual dysfunction was a constant source of humiliation. He became a teacher, but was forced to leave the profession after accusations of molesting his students. This lifelong sense of failure, socially, professionally, and most importantly, sexually, created a well of rage within him. He found that the only way he could achieve sexual arousal and release was through the act of violence. The sight of his victim's suffering and death was inextricably linked to his sexual gratification. It was a dark and twisted rewiring of his most basic instincts. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first known murder. He lured a 9-year-old child into an old house and committed a violent crime in a fit of rage. The act of violence provided him with a psychological release connected to his deep-seated disorders. This horrific discovery would define the next 12 years of his life, setting him on a path of relentless violence. Chikatilo became a hunter, stalking the bus stops and train stations of the Rostov region. He preyed on the vulnerable, children, runaways, prostitutes, and the homeless. These were the invisible people of Soviet society, individuals whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed. He would use his unassuming, grandfatherly appearance to lure them away with promises of money, alcohol, or a ride. Once he had his victims in a secluded location, his rage would erupt. He would subject them to horrific torture and mutilation. The stabbings were frenzied and numerous, often targeting the eyes and sexual organs. These acts of mutilation were not random. They were symbolic expressions of his own sexual rage and frustration. The violence itself was the point, the only thing that could satisfy his twisted desires. For years, the Soviet authorities were unable to catch him. The investigation was hampered by a rigid and inefficient bureaucracy. In the Soviet Union, the official ideology held that serial murder was a decadent, capitalist phenomenon that could not exist in their socialist utopia. As a result, police departments in different districts did not share information, and the idea of a single killer being responsible for so many crimes was repeatedly dismissed. This institutional blindness allowed Chikatilo to kill with near impunity for over a decade. He was arrested on suspicion of murder in 1984, but was released due to a blood and semen type mismatch. The science was flawed. Chikatilo had a rare condition where his blood type differed from his semen type, but the authorities, convinced of their infallibility, let a monster walk free. Emboldened by his release, Chikatilo's killing spree intensified. He became more brazen, his attacks more frequent. The Rostov region lived in a state of terror. The killer was known as the Red Ripper, a phantom who haunted the forests and train lines. The investigation became the largest in Soviet history, but it was a clumsy and often brutal affair, with investigators rounding up and coercing confessions from hundreds of innocent people. Finally, in the era of glasnost and perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev, the old ways began to change. A new, more open approach to the investigation was adopted. A psychiatrist was brought in to create a psychological profile of the killer, a technique that was revolutionary in the Soviet Union at the time. The profile suggested the killer was a man like Chikatilo, older, seemingly normal, but with a history of sexual dysfunction. On November 20th, 1990, Chikatilo was finally caught. He was seen leaving a wooded area near a train station where a body was later found. He was placed under surveillance and arrested a few days later. This time, the investigators were more prepared. They brought in a psychiatrist who engaged Chikatilo in a long psychological battle of wills. Over several days, the psychiatrist broke down Chikatilo's defenses and he began to confess. The confession was a torrent of horror. He admitted to 56 murders, though he was ultimately convicted of 52. He described his crimes in graphic detail, explaining the link between his sexual impotence and his need to kill. He saw himself as a victim, a man cursed by a cruel fate, a mistake of nature. He showed no remorse, only a detached interest in his own pathology. His trial in 1992 was a media sensation, a symbol of the dark secrets of the old Soviet regime being exposed to the world. He was kept in a cage in the courtroom to protect him from the victims' families. He behaved erratically, shouting, singing, and exposing himself. It was a final, pathetic attempt to be seen as insane, but the court was not swayed. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head in February 1994. His brain was preserved for scientific study, a final attempt to find a physical explanation for his monstrous deeds. Chikatilo's motive was a primal and pathetic one. He was not driven by a grand delusion or a complex philosophy. He was driven by failure. His entire life was a series of humiliations, culminating in the ultimate masculine failure in his eyes, sexual impotence. Murder became his only source of power, his only means of achieving gratification. The suffering of his victims was the price he made the world pay for his own profound and pathetic inadequacy. For our final case, we traveled to Nazi-occupied Paris, a city of fear, suspicion, and desperation. In this dark time, a respected doctor offered a glimmer of hope to those fleeing persecution, but his promise of salvation was a lie, a cover for a scheme of mass murder driven by a motive so purely and pathologically greedy that it stands as a chilling testament to the predatory nature of man. Dr. Marcel Petiot was a man of intelligence and charisma. Born in 1897, he was recognized as brilliant from a young age, but also deeply disturbed. He had a history of delinquency and mental instability, which led to him being expelled from several schools. He served in World War I, where he was wounded and gassed, and was later institutionalized for various psychiatric problems. Despite this, he managed to complete his medical degree with honors. He established a medical practice in the town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, where he quickly became a popular and seemingly dedicated physician. But beneath the surface, a darker side was at work. He was suspected of a variety of crimes, including theft, insurance fraud, and even the mysterious disappearance of a patient's daughter who had been his lover. Yet, his charm and political connections allowed him to evade any serious consequences. In the 1930s, he moved to Paris and set up a lucrative practice. He built a reputation as a brilliant doctor, known for his discreet and sometimes illegal services, such as performing abortions. When World War II broke out and Germany occupied Paris, Petiot saw a unique and monstrous opportunity. Paris was a trap for thousands of people, Jews, members of the resistance, and common criminals, all desperate to escape the clutches of the Gestapo. Petiot created a fictitious escape network, presenting himself as a savior who could smuggle people out of the country to South America. He called his network Fly Talks, a name that would prove to be a sickeningly ironic joke. He would charge his clients a hefty fee, often their entire life savings, for a guaranteed safe passage. He would instruct them to bring all of their valuables, cash, jewelry, gold, with them. He would then bring them to his townhouse at 21 Rue Lisieux, a respectable address in the heart of Paris. He told them that before their journey, they needed to be inoculated against tropical diseases. The inoculation was a lethal injection of cyanide. Once his victims were dead, Petiot would steal their valuables and dispose of their bodies. He had built a sophisticated disposal system in his basement. He had a gas chamber, where he would sometimes kill his victims, and a large coal-fired stove where he would burn the bodies. He would also dismember them and dissolve them in quicklime. For several years, under the cover of the chaos of war, Dr. Petiot operated his factory of death. He was a one-man extermination camp, preying on the most vulnerable people in their most desperate hour. His victims believed he was their last hope, a beacon of light in a world of darkness. In reality, he was a predator of the highest order, using their desperation as bait. His motive was pure, unadulterated greed. He was not driven by ideology, like the Nazis he was pretending to fight against. He was not driven by a sexual compulsion or a psychotic delusion. He was driven by a simple, all-consuming desire for wealth. Each victim was a walking treasure chest, and their death was merely the act of prying it open. He accumulated a vast fortune in cash, jewels, and property, all stolen from the people he had murdered. In March 1944, Petiot's horrific enterprise began to unravel. Neighbors complained of a foul, noxious smoke pouring from the chimney of his townhouse. Fearing a chimney fire, they called the police. When the authorities arrived, Petiot was not there. They broke into the house and were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. In the basement, they found the coal stove burning at full blast, stoked with human remains. They found piles of dismembered body parts, pits filled with quicklime and decomposing flesh, and suitcases filled with the belongings of the victims. The house was a slaughterhouse, a testament to years of systematic murder. The Gestapo initially took over the investigation, believing they had uncovered the headquarters of a resistance cell. But they soon realized this was something else, something far more sinister. By the time Paris was liberated later that year, the French authorities were hunting for Dr. Marcel Petiot, now dubbed Dr. Satan by the press. Petiot had gone into hiding, joining the French forces of the interior, the organized resistance. He grew a beard, adopted a new name, and presented himself as a war hero. He even wrote articles for the resistance newspaper, decrying the crimes of the man the police were looking for, himself. His audacity was boundless. He was finally captured in October 1944, after being recognized on the street. At his trial in 1946, he maintained his innocence with a brazen and theatrical performance. He claimed that he was a genuine resistance hero and that all the people he had killed were Nazi collaborators and Gestapo agents. He tried to portray himself as a patriot who had been forced to do dirty work for the good of France. He claimed his Fly Talks network was real and that he had killed only enemies of the state. It was a compelling story, one that played on the complex and often murky allegiances of the occupation. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution methodically dismantled his story, showing that the vast majority of his victims were Jews and others who had no connection to the Gestapo. Investigators were able to definitively link him to at least 27 murders, though the true number is believed to be much higher, possibly over 60. The sheer volume of stolen goods found in his possession pointed to a motive of profit, not patriotism. The jury saw through his lies. Marcel Petiot was found guilty of 26 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He showed no remorse, maintaining his heroic persona to the end. He was executed by guillotine in May 1946. His final words were reportedly a piece of advice to his lawyer: "Don't look, it will not be a pretty sight." Dr. Petiot's motive was a chillingly simple one, magnified by the unique horrors of his time. He was a predator who saw a world in chaos not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. He weaponized hope, selling a promise of freedom that was, in fact, a sentence of death. His evil was not complex or psychological. It was the pure, parasitic evil of a man who saw other human beings as nothing more than obstacles between him and their money. He was a doctor who, instead of preserving life, had mastered the art of profiting from its destruction. We have journeyed through 10 landscapes of the human soul at its most broken and terrifying. We have met a savior who sacrificed innocence to save the world from an imaginary earthquake, a vampire who drank blood to cure a delusional illness, and a shoemaker who sought to become God by orchestrating hell on earth. We have seen fantasies of survival, cannibalism, and collection brought to life with devastating consequences. We have witnessed motives born from greed, from rage against a single person, and from a lifetime of pathetic failure. Each of these killers was driven by an internal logic that, while incomprehensible to us, was the absolute reality that governed their worlds. Herbert Mullen truly believed he was a hero. Richard Chase was convinced he was dying. Joseph Kellinger was certain he was on a mission from God. These cases push the boundaries of our understanding of human behavior. They force us to confront the terrifying reality that the human mind, the most complex and beautiful instrument in the known universe, can also be the most effective and terrifying weapon. It can construct realities so vivid and so compelling that they can justify any atrocity, reframe any act of evil as a necessary, even noble deed. While we can analyze their pasts, diagnose their conditions, and trace the crooked paths that led them to their crimes, a fundamental mystery will always remain. Why them? Why do some people who suffer trauma become killers, while millions of others do not? What is the precise alchemy of biology, environment, and choice that creates a special kind of evil? This is the question that will continue to haunt us, the question that lies at the very heart of our fascination with the darkest aspects of our own nature. These stories serve as a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who lurk in the shadows of fiction, but the ones who walk among us, hidden behind masks of normalcy. They are the ones whose motivations are so twisted, so alien, that they defy our attempts to rationalize them, leaving us with a chilling and profound sense of the unknowable darkness that can reside within the human mind.